You may think that you've got a pretty good idea of what a species is, and you may think that you have a pretty good idea of when two organisms belong to the same species and when they don't. And most of the time, even if you hadn't ever studied biology, you'd be right. You can tell one species of animal or plant apart from one another most of the time. In fact, over 99% of the time, assigning an individual animal or a plant to a particular species is really unproblematic. If two populations live close together and they exchange genes, we say they're in the same species. If they live far apart and they look really different from one another, we say they're not in the same species. And these extremes are no problem. But there are some intermediate cases that are real headaches. So here's a case where you've clearly got two different species. One of these birds is called the European herring gull, and the other is called the lesser black-backed gull. They occur in the same place, they clearly do not breed together, and they look quite different. However, when you look more closely at this case, it's more complicated. The, the lesser black-backed gull occurs here, where it does not interbreed with the European herring gull. The problem is that the lesser black-backed gull does interbreed with this population of the lesser black-backed gull across Siberia. That in turn interbreeds with Hugelin's gull here, which in turn interbreeds with Birula's gull over here. Birula's gull can interbreed with the Vega gull, which can interbreed with the American herring gull, which in turn does interbreed with the European herring gull. So when you have these two birds side by side in Europe, are they one species or not? There are other cases where it gets difficult to tell which organisms are the same species and which aren't. So for example, there's a raven by the name of Corvus coronae that occurs in Western Europe, and another one called Corvus cornix that looks quite different over here in Eastern Europe. But there's also a hybrid zone, a zone where these organisms meet and interbreed, and you often find ravens that are of an intermediate appearance to these two species. So are these two the same species or not? Worse are examples of some plants, which the extremes look very different from one another. Obviously, you would never mistake this leaf for this one. But when they mate and produce offspring, those offspring have this whole range of leaf shapes. And genetically, you find individuals that are all the way from pure Grisaea, pure gray oak, over to pure Gambel's oak, and everything in between. But the worst case of all are the microbes, because we have no idea, according to our usual criterion of who interbreeds with who, which microbes belong in the same species and which don't. I mentioned this at the beginning of the course, but human beings tend to think in categories. And that's actually a problem. It's a particular problem when it comes to thinking about species, because we think of these categories as being real. Okay, what is real is the individual, not the category. As I said at the beginning of the course, we tend to think as though the category chair is real, that there's some kind of chairness out there that is really essential, and the individual chairs are sort of temporary instantiations or examples of chairness. It's the other way around. There is no chairness. There are only a bunch of chairs. In the same way, there are no real species. There are only the individual organisms. And sometimes, because it's useful to do so, we can group them together into categories that we call species. Individual organisms exist, but all taxa above the individual, including species, are really artificial concepts. They're convenient for us, but they don't necessarily accord to any objective reality. That doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about them, that doesn't mean we shouldn't use these concepts, but we should remember that they have limits. So just because two organisms are in the same species does not mean that they are exactly the same. Just because two organisms are in different species doesn't mean that they can perhaps even interbreed and exchange genes. There are going to be a lot of gray areas that you'll run across if you continue to be a biologist. There are a lot of different species concepts that people have come up with. What these concepts are their rules, basically, that we can use to organize facts about organisms. None of these works 100% of the time. All of them have pros and cons. They're useful in different settings, they're useful in different areas, but they all also have weaknesses. They have an Achilles heel, a group of cases where you can't really apply one of these species concepts to determine whether two things are a species or not. And we're not going to talk very much about these different concepts, although there are a couple that you should be aware of. The concept that I want you to be most aware of here is the concept of the biological species concept, because that's the one that's used most by working biologists. A biological species, according to the species concept, is a group of individuals that can either actually interbreed, they are interbreeding now, or they could potentially interbreed if they were in the same location. And this group is isolated from other such groups. This was a species concept that was championed by the famous biologist Ernst Mayr back in the 40s. And it's one of the more useful of the species concepts. It's useful because when you define species this way, what you've got is a bunch of different evolutionarily independent units. Okay, you've got different gene pools, basically evolving separately. And let me explain a little bit how this works. Suppose that, and this is an example I put together in the university where I work in Southern California, suppose that you've got a population of squirrels in a particular area. And then one day you get a mutant squirrel who has a higher fitness than the rest. What's going to happen to that mutation? Well, we've already talked about what natural selection does to allele frequencies when one allele is under selection. That allele is going to spread through the population, and pretty soon every squirrel in the population is going to be characterized by having this mutant big S allele. Okay? Now, if you have two different towns that are near one another, and the squirrels in one of those towns experiences this big S mutation, it's going to spread through that population, and then it's going to spread to the other population because you get individuals that migrate back and forth between these two populations. And so a gene that arises over here, or sorry, an allele that arises over here isn't going to be confined to this population. Because these individuals can interbreed with this one, it's going to spread. However, if you have populations of rabbits that are scattered around the same landscape, they are not going to be changed when this big S allele spreads through the squirrel population. Why not? Because the squirrels and the rabbits don't interbreed. They don't exchange genes. And so basically what happens in the squirrel gene pool stays in the squirrel gene pool. These two species will go on separate paths through evolutionary history. Okay, so that's one of the advantages to using the biological species concept. There are some disadvantages to the species concept. There are places or situations where it simply doesn't work. For example, if you have two populations that are geographically separated from one another, they are not actually interbreeding. And how do you know if they're potentially interbreeding? What you have to do is have them together and see if they interbreed. And there are plenty of organisms that will interbreed in, say, captivity that won't interbreed in the wild. So you can't know if you bring two species or two organisms together in the wild and they mate, whether or not that's the sort of thing that would really happen in the wild anyway. Then there are a lot of organisms that are asexuals. By the definition that's given by the biological species concept, every asexual is kind of its own species because it's isolated from all other organisms. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. That doesn't help. We also don't necessarily know how much reproductive isolation is enough to define a new species. As you've read about in The Beak of the Finch, there are times and situations where the different species of Darwin's finches on the Galapagos interbreed and interbreed quite successfully. But then there are other times when interbreedings between the species result in offspring that don't do very well. So there is some gene flow between these populations. Is that enough to call them all one species? Or are the differences between these groups of birds enough that we ought to call them separate species? There is no clear rule. And one of the reasons I had you read The Beak of the Finch was to give you a sense that really the natural world, the biological world, is in flux all the time. Populations shift and change as they evolve, and also as they evolve, populations kind of glom together, they share a gene pool, or they pull apart, and the links between them can be stronger or weaker over time. Everything in an evolving biological world is constantly in motion. And that really throws a monkey wrench into our ideas of fixed categories like species. Okay, so that's how the world is. And it is complicated. It is in flux. It is in motion. It's not going to fit into categories very well. There are a couple of other species concepts which you maybe ought to be aware of because they really are used quite a bit. A morphological species just looks different from other species. An ecological species is one that's different from others ecologically in some way that's important. And you probably see right away that there are some severe problems with these species concepts. The main advantage to them, and the reason why they're used at all, is that they're convenient. They're really easy to apply. However, organisms that look different may not necessarily be evolutionarily independent. Those that look the same may be actually evolutionarily separated. There are lots of organisms that are what we call cryptic species. They look identical, maybe even to experts, but they're not exchanging genes. They don't mate with one another, and so technically they're traveling independently through evolutionary space. For the ecological species concept, one big problem is who defines what's important ecologically, important enough to call something a separate species. And this can actually change over time. So for example, there is an organism called Anopheles maculopinus. It's a mosquito, but we've discovered that in fact it's 6 different species of mosquito. They all look very similar. The difference, as far as we're concerned, the important difference, is that some can transmit malaria to human beings and others can't. Well, that's a big ecological difference. There didn't used to be. So the definition of an ecological species concept, or sorry, the definition of an ecological species is something that's kind of muddy and unstable. In practice, we would like to use the biological species concept, and that's sort of what most biologists say, yeah, that's really what ought to define a good species. In practice, very often the morphological species concept gets used, or the ecological species concept, because it's really hard to tell who is interbreeding. Instead of figuring that out, what we usually do is we look at the morphology of 2 organisms, or we look at their genetics, and if they're sufficiently different, we say, all right, we're just going to call those 2 different species.